This video is brought to you by Skillshare. More about them later. America's political labeling is kind of confused in relation to the rest of the world's.
At the time I was born, and for much of the 20th century, someone who believed in low taxes, fewer regulations, and less government spending was considered a conservative. But in Europe, someone with those same beliefs would be called a liberal. During that same time period, a person who believed in using higher taxes and greater regulation to redistribute wealth would be called a liberal, but in Europe, that person is called a progressive.
Well, when I was younger, and for most of the life of Gen X and baby boomers as well, somebody who was on the political left was just a liberal, and somebody on the political right was just a conservative. But thanks to internet socialists over the last decade, we have seen a shift begin to occur in this. After all, liberals get the bullet too. So what's going on here? Why is America's political labeling so confused with the rest of the world's? Well, in order to fully understand this, we need to go back to the American Revolution.
Now, if you read books about the American Revolution published in the last 40 years or so, you'll see it described as either not a revolution or as a conservative revolution. Calling the American Revolution conservative might fall in line with what modern conservatives believe, but it's not what people at the time would have said. In the 18th and 19th century, the American Revolution was understood to be a liberal revolution, but it wasn't liberal in the sense that someone born and raised during the Cold War would understand it. Back then, a liberal was someone who believed in constitutionally limited government and individualism. This encompassed beliefs in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and free trade, and this was the understanding of liberalism until the 1920s and 30s. At the time of the American Revolution and much of the 19th century, conservatism would have been understood as loyalty to a particular set of institutions: the crown, the church, and the aristocracy. But the revolution severed Americans' ties from these institutions. They no longer had a king, and it's harder to set up a similar level of loyalty to the position of president, which cycles people out every 4 to 8 years.
I said hard, not impossible.
Sure, they had churches in their home states, but they lost their status as state churches shortly after the Constitution was ratified. And sure, the colonies had their own wealthy elites, but they didn't possess the hereditary titles of Europe, which gave them obligatory positions in the government.
This meant that conservatism in the United States was going to be more watered down, which allowed liberalism to become the dominant political ideology. However, all the major parties would have both liberal and conservative elements within them.
Throughout the 19th century, America's political parties weren't defined by political ideologies, but rather by various social and economic interests, which meant that both major parties had liberal and conservative elements in them. But in the late 19th century, a new ideology was imported from across the Atlantic: progressivism.
I have several videos about the progressive movement planned for the future, but I'm going to have to give you an abridged version of one of them here.
During the Gilded Age, the American economy was going through some growing pains, which generated problems in the cities that couldn't grow fast enough to sustain all the people moving in. At the same time, wealthy Americans had an inferiority complex towards European aristocracy. They tried to emulate them by building elaborate and luxurious mansions in the US, buying old aristocratic estates in Europe, taking frequent vacations across the continent, and most importantly, sending their children to be educated in European schools. Many of these children returned to America and began teaching in American universities, such as Johns Hopkins, which was created with the intent of importing the German university system into the US. Many of these European educated elites marveled at how involved the state was in the economy and the everyday lives of their citizens, and wanted to bring these ideas back to America. The conservative governments of Europe implemented policies such as unemployment insurance and old age pensions in order to undermine the more radical socialist movements from fostering violent revolution. This was the intellectual origin of the progressive movement, which attempted to solve the same problems that the domestically born populist movement had failed to do so.
But the populist movement might not have failed if they had had this video's sponsor, Skillshare.
Skillshare is the all-in-one learning platform with professionally made video tutorials to help you learn anything from video editing or running a YouTube channel to cooking, writing, and anything else you could possibly think of. New courses are always being added, and at less than $10 a month, it is definitely worth getting. And luckily, Skillshare has given you guys an offer. The first 1,000 of you to click the top link in the description or in the pinned comment below will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. Watch as much as you want, gain all the knowledge you can, and if it's right for you, then subscribing is easy. Less than $10 a month or under $100 for an entire year. I suggest either taking one of Jordy Vanderput's numerous courses on video editing, or Marquez Brownlee's new course on running a YouTube channel. Thanks to Skillshare for supporting this channel, but for now, back to the history.
And so around the year 1900, we have three main political strands in the United States. We have a watered-down 18th century conservatism, we have the liberalism of the Enlightenment, and we have a new conservatism coming from Europe that has been infused with some socialist policies that in the US became known as Progressivism. And there were people consisting of all three political strands existing within both the Republican and Democratic parties.
The Progressives had placed much of their movement's identity with the successes of Europe, but World War I derailed progressivism in the United States. Those same, supposedly more advanced and humane Europeans had plunged the world into the deadliest war ever seen. And so Americans turned away from progressivism. It's in the 1920s that we begin to see the beginning of the shift in labeling we use. Progressivism had gotten a bad reputation because of the war, but it was still seen as less bad than socialism or communism. So many socialists and communists in the US started calling themselves progressives. At this time, we begin to see a fusing of liberalism and conservatism happen on the American right, a fusing of loyalty to institutions with a dedication to individualism. However, the pre-war progressives hadn't gone away, but their ideology had been publicly besmirched. So over the course of the 1920s, they began to refer to their own ideology as liberalism. It was the presidency of FDR that solidified this transformation. He referred to his Wilsonian progressivism as liberalism.
It is a vote that had more than mere party significance. It transcended party lines and became a national expression of liberal thought. It means, I am sure, that the masses of the people of the nation firmly believe that there is great and actual possibility in an orderly recovery through a well-conceived and actively directed plan of action.
By the end of FDR's presidency, early century progressivism had successfully been rebranded as liberalism. But there was a problem.
Historians had a difficult time reconciling the liberalism of FDR with the history of liberalism prior to the New Deal, and so they started referring to pre-FDR liberalism as classical liberalism.
And so, by the start of the Cold War, liberals were rebranded progressives, and conservatives were a fusion of classical liberalism and classical conservatism. But in the 1970s, the policies of the New Deal began to fall apart, which I also have a video planned for in the future, so make sure you click that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss that when it comes out.
As New Deal policies were failing, a new narrative was popularized by the right. Liberalism had failed, and America needed a new era of conservatism in order to right the course.
During the 1980s, the old FDR liberals began to fray. Liberalism began to be associated with being weak on foreign policy and crime. And in a time where it looked like the US had been in retreat abroad and an actual rising crime rate at home, the narrative was potent. By the end of the 1980s, many of the younger FDR liberals began to refer to themselves as progressives.
At the same time, we see the word neoliberalism come into fashion, and it has become a boogeyman to the left ever since. However, it didn't originate at this time. In fact, its first usage was in the 1890s when the original liberalism was still going strong. And in the decades prior to its alleged usurpation of American politics and economics, it was used by numerous writers, none of whom agreed on what it actually meant. And you don't see a consistent definition used until the 1980s. And nowadays, especially online, we see the word neoliberalism used similarly to that of fascism, in that it's basically just a grab-bag term to lump a bunch of stuff that the left doesn't like, but they admit isn't as bad as fascism.
So on the right in circa 1990, we have modern conservatism, which is a fusion of classical liberalism, classical conservatism, and a dab of populism that would grow over time. And on the left, we have what historians have begun to refer to as New Deal liberalism in order to differentiate it from both classical liberalism and the confusing mess that is neoliberalism. At this time, some New Deal liberals were still referring to themselves as liberals, but an increasing number were referring to themselves as progressives.
Let's check back in on the far left real quick.
During the Cold War, the socialists and communists in the US would be divided into those that supported the Soviet Union, who openly called themselves socialists and communists, and those that didn't, who tended to call themselves progressives.
Well, these progressives didn't stop calling themselves progressives just because New Deal liberals started calling themselves progressives again.
In the 2010s, we see internet leftists begin to reassert a differentiation between socialists or progressives on the one hand, and the liberalism of their parents, with the slogan, "Liberals get the bullet too." Points for honesty, I suppose.
And so now it's the 2020s and America still has this confusing mess of political labels. None of these words are used in the way they were 100 years ago. Should we go back to these original meanings? Can we even define what they actually mean now? Do we even have the patience to have these conversations in a civilized way? Or should we just scrap the whole thing and start over? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.